Hello everyone, today we talk about Turenne and Montecuccoli's Rhine campaigns, essentially some of the most important modern art of war textbooks campaigns to date, making the firmament of the greatest commanders in history richer, if anything, because Turenne died in action during them, also for the Holy Roman Imperial Generalissimo Montecuccoli, and other commanders under them. So obviously we don't have to present these names. I discovered with horror that many people do not know who Turenne and Montecuccoli were, and or they knew either one or the other. I remember years ago, one of my followers commented, I knew Turenne, of course, but Montecuccoli never heard. So if you have never heard of him, like you would never heard of the Rhine campaigns of Turenne as well as a consequence. So what do you actually know about Turenne? What do you mean by hearing? You literally know the name, but of course you do not know anything about the entire context. This is what true European warfare in the later 17th century looks like at the top levels. In fact, in the intricate tapestry of the century of the old world's art of war, the rivalry between Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne, the Vicomte de Turenne, 1611-1675, French marshal whose career began under Richelieu in the 30 Years' War, winning at Freiburg, 1644, with Condé, that we will see also involved in the Rhine campaigns. I made a video about the Battle of Freiburg. We really have to make more videos about the 30 Years' War, the Italian wars. Speaking again of Turenne, Nördlingen, 1645, matured through the Front rebellions, where he switched sides twice, yet retained Louis XIV's trust, and culminated in the Dutch War, that we also made a video recently on the Rampillard, with the same lightning Rhine crossings, 1672, renowned for his audacious mobility, logistical ingenuity, and ability to sustain campaigns in hostile terrain. On the other side, we have Raimondo Montecuccoli, 1609-1680, the Imperial Field Marshal forged as well in the 30 Years' War. It's very interesting to see how generationally this worked. I made a video about Montecuccoli years ago, mostly treating him as the cornerstone in military theory between Machiavelli and von Clausewitz, that also most people do not literally realize being so. Like, what do you think Western thought was regarding war in early modern period? If you do not know, like if you're properly not familiar with the cultural milieu of, again, France, Germany, the Italy, and so on, in this period you cannot fundamentally understand as a whole what European warfare was about. Spain, unfortunately, again, I speak mostly to people that I know normally don't visit these places, so in a broader cultural sense. And for this reason, I hope with this video is to properly explain why these people were important, right? If for Montecuccoli were just to make the list of the military titles bestowed on him by the Holy Roman Emperor would never end. Montecuccoli was one of the few commanders at the time to provide an extensive amount of theoretical work that essentially paved the way for also von Clausewitz's intuitions. Montecuccoli was properly a myth, right? We've seen it also in the videos about Prince Eugen, and there, in fact, that we should learn to jump from generation to generation. Montecuccoli was the hero of that generation. Later, Prince Eugene was the hero of that generation. That the same Prussian military observers that looked at, for example, the siege of Turin would turn out to inform also Frederick the Great's army generation, military thought. So that informed Napoleon, who considered, by the way, Turenne also one of the greatest generals in history to begin with. So we're really looking at such deeply intricate tapestry of military commanders and also military theory as it was gradually sort of stepping further towards a more comprehensive, applicable sort of manual, an overall understanding of war that will be achieved and never surpassed since, only with von Clausewitz. All right. And Montecuccoli had an extraordinary curriculum as well. He defended Vienna against the Swedish siege in 1645, we will see now how this connects with later Viennese warfare. He was honed in the Second Northern War as well, relieving Copenhagen in 1659, and elevated in particular in the Austro-Turkish War with the victory at St. Gotthard in 1664. 20 years, not even before the second siege of Vienna from the one of the 16th century. And hadn't it been for Montecuccoli's victory in 1664 over the Ottoman army, Vienna would have fallen. Because at the time, they didn't have the walls that withstood the second siege later on, and they were initiated also properly by Montecuccoli's push, because, as you understand here, he was basically the overall commander of the entire Habsburgic forces. He had risen to that level. He was celebrated for his methodical caution, engineering prowess, and mastery of defensive positioning that he illustrated in his works, and he also enacted during the Franco-Dutch War, because he was unitly here, as we will see from the opposite side of Turenne, 1672, 1678, standing as a paragon, looking at both of them, really of strategic brilliance and tactical virtuosity that you really can't find rarely in other times and places, because it is really normal for great leaders to always find some sort of, not equivalent, but some fiery adversary. It's actually even rare to find in history some major war that does not have a major opponent in front of him. Look at Alexander, for example, in the conquest of the Achaemenid Empire. But between Montecuccoli and Turenne, there is really an alchemy, great respect. These were, again, times of honor, of nobility, of still this feudal mentality that permeated the era both across France and the Holy Roman Empire. That's why their confrontations across the Rhineland and Alsace were a crucible for the evolving art of war. We're looking at a time in which, as you know, especially Western European military are really stepping up. Louis XIV creates the first modern national army worth this name. The Imperials lag behind, but they also have allies. They send his best men to counter the French on the Rhine, right? And these campaigns resulting are characterized, we will see now, by deft maneuvers, calculated deceptions, and an unparalleled mastery of terrain and logistics. So this account, this video chronicles the 6 key engagements of the Rhine campaign, including the ones fought after Turenne's death, because as a whole, also what Montecuccoli did afterwards is very interesting. Namely, the siege of Bonn from November the 3rd to the 12th of 1673, the Battle of Sinsheim, 16 of June 1674, the Battle of Ensheim, October the 4th, 1674, the Winter Campaign culminating in the Battle of Turkheim, January the 5th, 1675, the maneuvers leading to the Battle of Salzbach on July the 27th, 1675, where Turenne was mortally wounded by a cannonball while reconnoitering, and the Battle of Altenheim on August the 1st, 1675, fought under Turenne's successor Condé, that had constituted, by the way, a duo already in the previous years, as we're hinting at, for example, Freiburg, against a still living Montecuccoli, weaving a comprehensive, chronologically ordered sort of picture of the war, delving into the sort of operational intricacies, logistical challenges, and strategic interplay that defined these giants' campaigns, while also illuminating the broader context of the war and its impact on European military thought. That is to say, why were these campaigns important, and why were textbooks cases of strategic capacity and practice. So the Franco-Dutch War we observed in multiple videos by now, recently also again made a video about the Rampillard crisis. It had been ignited by Louis XIV's ambitious invasion of the Dutch Republic, where in May 1672. This had initially seen French forces bolstered by their Cologne and Münster allies, these princely bishops that were, in fact, provided with armies on their own and were sympathizing, of course, with Catholic France against the Dutch that were not even entirely Protestant, achieved sweeping successes, overrunning much of the Netherlands in a blitz of disciplined aggression. By July, however, Dutch resilience, fortified by strategic flooding of their lands, famously they broke their own dams in order to bog the French down, because they arrived a few tens of miles from Amsterdam, and alliances with Brandenburg, Prussia, the same Emperor Leopold I, and Spain halted French momentum. Made lots of videos about the general international situation of the era for the series about Vienna. So if you're interested in Leopold I, just know that made lots of videos about him. And we'll continue also our series about the Habsburgs. We ended at the sort of beginning of the 30 Years' War, the conquest of the Palatinate. So the entry of an imperial army under Montecuccoli into the Rhineland in August 1673 escalated the war, shifting the theater of France's eastern frontiers and compelling Louis XIV to abandon most Dutch gains to protect Alsace and Lorraine. Turenne, one of France's most seasoned marshals, was tasked with defending Alsace against Montecuccoli, a commander whose strategic reputation already at the time, honed, as we've seen during the 30 Years' War, rivaled Turenne's own. Both men steeped in the era's, say, incipient linear tactics, and in fact witnessing to an incredible fluidification of armies' mobility, maneuverability, as well as logistical discipline. The French in particular were concentrating their administrative resources to centralize further their army organization, approached warfare as a chess match, where every march, feint, and engagement was a calculated move to outwit the opponent. It was a great muscle-to-muscle, great iron arm. If you're interested in the art of war of the year, I naturally made multiple videos about 17th century warfare. This will, as we've seen also in the series about Marlborough's era, just at the beginning of the 18th century, was still, in fact, it was more dynamic, was still very paralyzed, so to say, around sieges with very great difficulties to break through. Paradoxically, there was some greater mobility in time where armies were small, at least on the map, because it was sort of more difficult even to check them. And so eventually the cumbersomeness, I would say, of armies was mostly due to sort of lack of supplying capacities from, in fact, this coalescing modern states than an actual rigidity for other reasons. Battlefield tactics were a bit clumsier because the pike was still around in a sort of consistent fashion. At this point, firepower is really increasing. I made also a video about, in fact, the firepower doctrines between the French, the British, and the Dutch themselves. We will come back surely on these topics. And so when you look at Turenne and Montecuccoli's rivalry, which began in earnest in 1673, you're looking also at the unfolding of a series of engagements that would test their intellectual and military prowess. We have seen in the Kampfkriege how von Clausewitz characterizes military genius through a very specific alchemy of essentially of knowledge, of rationale, but also coup d'oeil, like in sort of capacity to understand what is happening under the greatest pressure, or in the direst of circumstances, would tend to obnubilate judgment, to stress you out even just from a physical point of view, and also courage. And so that combining this in a rational sense, determination. You may know well what to do, but not having properly the guts, the backbone to do so. And of course, commanders are always crushed the most of any other element of the army, given that the responsibility of this enormous business, and in this case, Europe's power balance, is literally in their hands, right? And this issue will shape the course of the war, as well as the development of strategy during the same. So in 1673, Montecuccoli, commanding imperial forces, outmaneuvered Turenne in the Rhineland with a campaign of strategic finesse. Operating along the Neckar and Rhine rivers, he executed a series of rapid marches and deceptive maneuvers, avoiding direct confrontation while targeting French supply lines to weaken their operational capacity. The French were stronger, right? Montecuccoli's strategy relied on attrition and positional advantage to level this odds, exploiting the mobility of his 25,000-strong army to keep Turenne's larger forces off balance. By late October, Montecuccoli crossed the Main near Frankfurt, using a pontoon bridge constructed under cover of darkness to outflank French defenses along the Tauber. By early November, he reached Koblenz, where he united with William III of Orange's Dutch and Spanish forces, forming a formidable combined army of approximately 48,000 men, which is a lot also for the time, including 30,000 infantry and 18,000 cavalry, which is actually insane if you really think that, again, linear tactics were about sort of to take off in a more consistent way. There was a freaking lot of cavalry, knightly, chivalry, capacity and force all around. Naturally, also a lot of fire and stopping power from the side of the infantry still. The pike was already there in open field. The imperial, so the Allied at this point, objective was Bonn, the residence of Maximilian Henry, Elector of Cologne, a key French ally, as we've seen, whose fortified city served as a logistical hub for French operations in the Netherlands. The siege of Bonn from November the 3rd to the 12th, 1673, was a masterstroke of Allied coordination, showcasing Montecuccoli's logistical acumen, that fluidified, in fact, the operations, and William's aggressive siegecraft as well. The city, defended by a garrison of 1,700 to 2,000 French and Cologne troops under Révillon, was encircled by Allied forces, with Montecuccoli establishing his headquarters at Godesberg and William at Rheindorf. Turenne, positioned along the Moselle near Kreuznach with approximately 30,000 men, was unable to intervene directly, constrained by the threat of an imperial invasion of Alsace and the need to protect French garrisons at Trier and Mainz. The Allied siege progressed with remarkable speed. Dutch engineers, renowned for their expertise, constructed siege works, while Imperial and Dutch batteries, totaling 40 guns, opened fire on November the 8th, breaching the city's outer fortifications near the Cologne Gate. On November the 11th, Dutch troops, supported by Spanish tercios, stormed a critical Ravelin after intense hand-to-hand combat, suffering 200 casualties, but securing a foothold. Internal dissent among Cologne's burghers, who resented the French occupation, and the garrison's dwindling supplies forced Révillon to surrender on November the 12th. The garrison was permitted to withdraw to Neuss with full honors, but the fall of Bonn severed French communications with their Dutch outposts, compelling Louis to evacuate most of his forces from the Republic of the Netherlands. Montecuccoli's success, achieved without a pitched battle, marked a significant setback for Turenne, who withdrew to Lorraine and Alsace to regroup. His army, weakened by disease, desertion, and the loss of strategic initiative, especially in the gigantic effort against the Netherlands that had, in fact, been really leviathanic against the much smaller Dutch defenses. The effort was adequate for that target, but it's still bogged down because of the enormity of the same forces. Like this, France was the only country capable of waging war that way, as is the continentally hegemonic power in Europe. The strategic landscape shifted dramatically in early 1674 as a consequence, as the anti-French coalition strengthened. Denmark's entry in January, followed by the Treaty of Westminster in February, which ended the Third Anglo-Dutch War, isolated France diplomatically and militarily. Louis, recognizing the threat to his eastern frontier, appointed Turenne to command in Alsace, tasking him with preventing imperial forces from invading eastern France or linking with the Dutch. Facing a numerically superior enemy, potentially 60,000 men, if Imperial, Brandenburg, and Dutch forces united, Turenne leveraged the French army's logistical reforms, spearheaded by Secretary of War Louvois, one of the most powerful men of the era, which provided superior supply chains and enabled year-round campaigning. His strategy was to engage his opponents piecemeal, exploiting speed and surprise to prevent their consolidation, given that basically he was, in a broader sense, on the defensive, but well supplied, and so could easily pass to the counteroffensive at a local level. Montecuccoli temporarily retired in 1674 due to the appointment of Frederick William, the Great Elector of Brandenburg, as commander-in-chief, led Alexander von Bournonville to lead the imperial forces, though he would return to face Turenne directly in 1675. The first engagement of 1674, the Battle of Sinsheim, June the 16th, saw Turenne seize the initiative to prevent an imperial detachment under Aeneas de Caprara. It's another famous Italian commander of the Holy Roman Empire, from joining Bournonville's main army near Heidelberg. Crossing the Rhine near Felixburg with a compact force of 8,000 men, 4,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry. So again, you're talking the end of the 17th century. Here, there are higher proportions of cavalry than in the Middle Ages on a regular basis. Turenne intercepted Caprara's 8,500-strong force outside Sinsheim. The Imperials were deployed defensively, with infantry entrenched along edge rows and gardens at the village's entrance, supported by cavalry on the flanks. We've seen similar engagements at Freiburg. There was a lot, again, of positional warfare, not just from a strategic, but from a tactical point of view. Turenne demonstrating tactical flexibility. We've seen at Freiburg, by the way, the shocking capacity of the French forces to storm trench after trench, suffering very heavy losses, like up to 2/5 in a couple of days, and still being operationally capable. So it's something incredible, and that, by the way, speaks volume of what France was becoming, just in terms of sheer military power. But historically, the French had not had much of a strong infantry up to the national infantry, at least up to the end of the 16th century, and these changes are really prodigious. But there is a lot there of aristocratic ethos ingrained in this. So that Turenne deployed his infantry and dismounted dragoons to force the outposts, crossing the Elzans River under fire and entering Sinsheim's outskirts. The Imperials retreated to a plateau behind the village, accessible only through a narrow passage flanked by dense hedgerows, a fortified castle, and a vineyard, creating a natural choke point. Turenne positioned his infantry and dragoons to provide covering fire, enabling his cavalry, led by the Comte de Roye, to advance through the passage. They broke through with cavalry. Like when Caprara launched a counterattack with his cuirassiers, French infantry supported by artillery repelled the assault, inflicting heavy losses estimated at 2,000 to 3,000, including 800 dead. Right, this was veritable carnage, and it's incredibly interesting to see how even some sort of choke point, probably forced with hand-down cavalry charges that were counteracted by other horsemen, and everything was sort of happening under fire, muskets, artillery. It's really insane, but still very military sound. French casualties were lighter, around 1,000, but Turenne failed to prevent Caprara from linking with Bournonville. Nevertheless, the victory allowed Turenne to ravage the Palatinate in July, burning over 20 villages and destroying crops to deny the Imperials resources for an Alsace invasion. This campaign showcased Turenne's ability to exploit mobility, terrain, and local numerical superiority, gaining the strategic upper hand despite his smaller force. By September 1674, Bournonville, commanding over 40,000 troops, crossed the Rhine at Strasbourg. a neutral city whose bridge, controlled by its magistrates, facilitated imperial movements. Awaiting 20,000 reinforcements from Frederick William, Bournonville positioned his army at Ensheim, south of Strasbourg, to consolidate his forces. Turenne, with a smaller army of 22,000, 12,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, executed a rapid night march from Molsheim on October the 2nd to the 3rd, crossing the Bruche River to reach Ensheim by dawn on October the 4th. The swift maneuver surprised Bournonville, cutting him off from Strasbourg's bridge. Bournonville, with 35,000 men and 50 guns, adopted a strong defensive posture. His infantry centered on the village of Ensheim, supported by cavalry under Charles of Lorraine, with his right concealed by meadows and vineyards, and his left anchored by a ditch and the so-called Little Wood, a dense copse defended by 8 guns and 6 infantry battalions under Holstein-Plön. Turenne formed his army in 2 lines, with infantry in the center under Louis-François de Boufflers, and cavalry on the wings under the Marquis de Vaubron and Guy Aldonce de Durfort de Lorge. His artillery, organized into 4 batteries of 8 guns, supported an initial assault on the Little Wood by 8 infantry battalions and dismounted dragoons. After 2 hours of fierce combat, the first assault was repulsed with heavy French losses, particularly among the British Brigade, including regiments under George Hamilton and John Churchill. That was there. We talked about this in the video about the Duke of Marlborough. This lost 600 men and keen officers like Lord Charles Murray. A second assault, reinforced by battalions under Puisieux, failed due to torrential rain and mud that bogged down artillery and infantry. Naturally, yes, the English and the French were allied during this war. We've seen it well in the video about the Rampierre. Vaubron's cavalry attempted to outflank the Wood, but was repelled by Imperial dragoons, while Imperial cuirassiers overran the French left, nearly routing it. Delorge, exploiting the wet ground that disrupted the cuirassiers' cohesion, rallied his troops and restored the line. A third assault, led by Hamilton's brigade and supported by Rebellion's infantry, finally captured the Little Wood, threatening Bournonville's left. Turenne, cautious of further losses, halted direct assaults and bombarded Ensheim with artillery. By dusk, Bournonville, having lost between 3,000 and 4,000 men, retreated toward Colmar, leaving 1,200 wounded. French losses, around 3,500, were significant, but Turenne's aggression prevented an imperial invasion, establishing a psychological edge in securing Alsace temporarily. With Bournonville in winter quarters near Colmar, reinforced by Frederick William's 20,000 troops, Turenne defied 17th century conventions by launching his audacious winter campaign in December 1674, encamped between Saverne and Augenau with 33,000 men, including reinforcements from Condé's army in Champagne. Turenne exploited French logistical superiority with supply depots at Saverne, Augenau, and Brisach, ensuring provisions despite the season. To deceive Bournonville, he fortified Alsace strongholds like Sélestat and Obernai, suggesting a defensive posture, and split his army into smaller units to mask his intentions. Using the Vosges mountains to screen his movements, Turenne marched southwest through Lorraine, requisitioning supplies ruthlessly, often at gunpoint despite protests from local communities. By December the 18th, his forces reached Epinal, enduring snow, icy roads, and desertions that reduced his effective strength to 30,000. Turning southeast, he arrived at Belfort on December the 27th, positioning his army south of the imperial forces scattered around Colmar and Altkirch in winter quarters. On December the 29th, Turenne struck at Mulhouse, where Bournonville had dispatched Hermann of Baden-Baden with 5,000 cavalry to hold the city. I would like to stress again how important cavalry forces were. Some of these battles were even majority compared to infantry. Advancing with a 3,000-strong cavalry vanguard, Turenne encountered 7 imperial squadrons along the fordable Ill River. He ordered an attack led by the Marquis de Montauban, which escalated as both sides committed reinforcements. Turenne deployed a large force on his right, including the Garde Française, to feign a major assault, prompting the Imperial cuirassiers to retreat into Mulhouse and then flee toward Basel in disorder. French losses were minimal, around 60, including Montauban, who was captured after his horse was shot. Imperial casualties were likely 300, though some sources exaggerate up to 1,300. The swift victory disrupted Bournonville's cohesion, exposing his army's fragmented disposition and setting the stage for a decisive blow. On January 5, 1675, Turenne advanced north from Mulhouse to confront Bournonville's 30,000 to 50,000 troops near Turckheim between Colmar and Turckheim. The Imperial Army, still integrating its Brandenburg reinforcements, was unprepared with units dispersed in winter quarters. Turenne, commanding 30,000 men, employed unconventional tactics, feigning attacks from his center and right with artillery barrages and infantry skirmishes to fix Imperial attention. Meanwhile, he led a third of his army, including elite units like the Garde Suisse, on a concealed march around the Vosges foothills, capturing Turckheim village by surprise. Frederick William, commanding the Imperial right, attempted to retake the village with 8,000 men, but was repelled by French artillery and a disciplined infantry charge led by Boufflers. Turenne then struck the Imperial right, leveraging local numerical superiority and the speed of his attack, which omitted preliminary bombardment to maintain momentum. The Imperials, demoralized by the sudden assault and poor coordination, fled after suffering 3,400 casualties, including 1,200 dead, and abandoned 3,000 sick or wounded at Colmar. French losses were negligible, under 300. By mid-January, the defeated Imperial army evacuated Alsace, crossing the Rhine at Strasbourg's bridge, which Turenne could not secure due to the city's neutrality. This winter campaign, marked by strategic deception, bold maneuvering, and logistical resilience, secured France's eastern frontier and cemented Turenne's reputation as a master of warfare capable of defying seasonal constraints to achieve decisive results. In spring 1675, Montecuccoli returned to command the imperial forces, replacing Bournonville after the Turckheim debacle. With 32,000 men, 18,000 infantry, 14,000 cavalry, he aimed to reoccupy Alsace by crossing the Rhine at Strasbourg. On May 20th, he established his headquarters at Willstadt, opposite Strasbourg, and sent scouts to Kehl to probe French defenses. Turenne, commanding 35,000 men, 20,000 infantry, 15,000 cavalry, moved to block him on the west bank, demanding that Strasbourg's magistrates deny Montecuccoli the city's bridge, a critical crossing point as we've seen. Strasbourg, favoring the empire due to its economic ties and imperial pressure, permitted Montecuccoli to cross on May the 22nd, even supplying his headquarters with provisions and forage. Strasbourg was a consistent center, the capital of Alsace, so to say. Montecuccoli, cautious of Turenne's proximity, feigned a troop movement to Kehl with 6,000 men, but marched north instead, crossing the west bank near Speyer on May the 31st with his main army. This ruse aimed to draw Turenne from Strasbourg, exposing Alsace. Turenne, discerning the deception through intelligence from local informants, constructed temporary pontoon bridges at Ottenheim on June the 6th and crossed the east bank by June the 8th, establishing his headquarters at Willstadt to threaten Montecuccoli's rear. Montecuccoli's advance guard, led by Charles of Lorraine with 4,000 men, attacked the French lines on June the 9th, but was repelled after a sharp 2-hour engagement, losing 500 men to French artillery and cavalry charges. Montecuccoli then executed another feint, marching around Turenne's eastern flank to occupy Offenburg on June the 14th, threatening the Ottenheim bridges and forcing Turenne to respond. Turenne countered by relocating his brigades north, closer to Willstadt, on June the 16th and maintained a 3,000-man garrison there under Réveillon. For a week, both armies observed each other, constrained by supply shortages and persistent rain, which turned roads into quagmires and forced French horses to subsist on leaves, reducing their cavalry's effectiveness. A near-fatal incident on June the 18th, when local peasants fired on Turenne and his officers during a reconnaissance, killing a guard and wounding an aide, underscored the campaign's hazards. Overall, on July the 22nd, improved weather allowed Turenne to initiate a turning maneuver to pin Montecuccoli against the Rhine River, 10 miles from Strasbourg. The French vanguard under Vaubron attacked at Gamshurst on July the 23rd, but was repulsed by Imperial dragoons, losing 200 men. Montecuccoli's counterattack between July the 23rd and 24th, led by Enes de Caprara, was thwarted by dense fog, which disrupted coordination. Skirmishes persisted on July the 25th and the 26th, with both sides probing for weaknesses. Montecuccoli, facing dwindling forage and intelligence suggesting French reinforcements, withdrew north to entrench along the Rhine on July 26th, leaving 5,000 men under Caprara at Offenburg, delayed by a detour through the Black Forest foothills. Turenne positioned his main force to confront Montecuccoli while retaining his Willstadt garrison to secure his supply lines. He knew these lands, by the way, as we've seen in the video about the Battle of Freiburg. By July the 27th, attrition had reduced both armies to approximately 25,000 men. Montecuccoli entrenched behind the Salzbach stream, utilizing hedges, woods, a fortified church, and an old castle to create a formidable defensive line as he awaited Caprara's arrival. Imagine even what Europe had to look like at the end of the 17th century in terms of what had survived, from the Renaissance, from the Middle Ages, and really like this new war, this unprecedentedly scaled display of firepower and logistics was something tremendously devouring in these otherwise sort of idyllic landscapes of Central Europe. Turenne formed his army south of the stream, with infantry in front under Boufflers and cavalry behind under Deloge and Vaubron. He dispatched Pierre de Mornay, the Lord de Saint-Hilaire, to site 8 cannon, which bombarded the church and castle, though imperial field fortifications in the churchyard and cemetery, reinforced with gabions and stakes, mitigated their impact. French volunteers, including young nobles like the Chevalier de Grignon, fired on village houses to provoke a response, but Montecuccoli held his ground. An artillery duel ensued, with Turenne planning to attack if the Imperials began retreating, as their baggage train's movement toward Offenburg suggested indecision. At 2 p.m., while inspecting a battery with Saint-Hilaire, Turenne was struck by a cannonball, severing Saint-Hilaire's arm and killing Turenne instantly. This is the sheer level of brutality that, of course, every rank-and-file soldier routinely went under, but this dramatic end to such a monumental man speaks volumes about the risks that the European nobility was continuously exposed next to the overall responsibility of this. So this is incredibly brutal, gory, and terrible, even and especially because also it symbolized this new time in the art of war where the nobility as well was here confronted with unprecedented firepower and risks that sort of dwarfed the warriors, the commanders' greatness in a heroic sense. The French concealed Turenne's death initially. Imagine you are in the midst, by the way, of this incredibly frenetic and committed duel at the strategic level, and your commander-in-chief, that is the symbol of this all, dies. The French draped Turenne's cloak over his body, but morale collapsed as news quickly spread among the ranks. Montecuccoli, possibly informed by a deserter or intercepted dispatch, reportedly declared, quote, "Today died a man who did honor to mankind," a testament to his respect for his adversary, again, the nobility of Europe here is deeply sort of aware of the traditional role that leadership has, regardless of the deep divides that were ever more emerging in an ideological sense, or with the rise of a proto-nationalistic direction against, in this case, for example, also a universal rule, the fact that, of course, like, this was a post-Reformation world and so on. There were lots of sort of shades to all this, but the recognition of aristocracy, and especially of this enormous military talent, to say the least, for Turenne, it says it all about the figures involved. The Lodge assumed command amid disputes with Vaubran and other officers, including the Comte de Rhine, who questioned his decisions. The French artillery continued firing until dusk, but no major battle occurred. On July the 29th to 30th, the French retreated across the Rhine, pursued by Montecuccoli, who engaged them sharply at the Schutter River, killing 400 French stragglers, but failing to prevent their withdrawal to Alsace. Turenne's death plunged the French army into disarray, because it wasn't just a matter of moral forces, yes, that was crashing, but these minds were at this point in history still very much into the craft of logistics. They thought the army as a sort of neuralgic system, and without their practice, their coup d'oeil, in fact, their expertise, their experience, also keeping together such consistent forces under such dire circumstances were really very difficult. You can argue that only such leaders could. On July the 31st, the French began withdrawing over the Rhine at Altenheim, but only Vaubran's vanguard of 5,000 crossed, leaving the Lodge with the main body of 20,000 on the German side still. On August the 1st, as the Lodge crossed the Schutter to reach the Altenheim bridge, Montecuccoli attacked, as we've seen with his 30,000 strong army. Imperial cavalry, including Croatian light horse under Johann von Spork, captured Altenheim, severing the French retreat. The French rearguard, comprised by the brigade of Champagne and Hamilton's British regiments, including one led by Patrick Sarsfield, faced intense pressure. A series of desperate cavalry charges, supported by Bouffleur's infantry, recaptured the bridge, though one charge cost Vaubran his life, shot through the chest. By 1830, the French crossed, suffering 3,000 casualties, including 1,200 dead, with the British regiments losing 700 of 1,400 men. Imperial losses were higher, though, around 4,500, including 1,500 dead, because the French had fought back quite vigorously. We've seen this also British units selling their life quite dearly. The French preserved thus their army, but forfeited the initiative Turenne had secured, retreating to Saverne to regroup. Louis XIV, alarmed by the loss of Turenne, to say the least, recalled Condé, his cousin from retirement, despite his gout and declining health. Condé had a veritable distinguished career that we've also seen partially, at least for when he was younger. In fact, I made a video about the commanders of the 30 Years' War last year, and the video starts with Condé, as a matter of fact. It talks also about Turenne, as a matter of fact. So there you have the whole curriculum of this guy for the 30 Years' War, though. So doesn't talk about this other adventure that, as you understand, are also pretty later in time, like decades. These were the old guard, right? Turenne, Condé. They had, as we've seen, taken part in some of the most meaningful political and military events in France, domestically speaking. Think about the front, right? Condé positioned 15,000 men at Châtenois to block Montecuccoli, who faced mounting challenges at this point. French cavalry raids disrupted his supply lines, and smallpox outbreaks decimated his ranks. This is too sadly common for the armies of the era. You understand what kind of limitations were intrinsic. In fact, I made a video probably about the the strategic limitations of the armies, if anything, of the 30 Years' War, but again, in some ways, we're looking at very similar times still. With winter approaching, Montecuccoli abandoned his campaign, withdrawing across the Rhine in early November. Here we're not even talking about all the sort of political directives, because of course these commanders were in constant contact with their capitals, Paris, Vienna. That's also a very interesting story. We'll see it, if anything, in other dedicated videos. Condé, cautious and unwell, avoided further engagements as well, preserving his forces but ceding the offensive momentum to the Imperials, who regrouped for the 1676 campaign. Things actually went on, but since today we were just talking about Montecuccoli and Turenne, we sort of stop here, even though, again, this is just, in fact, an overview of these campaigns and battles, because, as you understand, it's all very, not much just tit for tat, but deeply intense and complicated battles of veritable bloodbaths. The operational complexity, as you understand here, with this maneuvering, counter-maneuvering, trying to cut the enemy retreat off, like and just the supply lines with hope, because that's also how mostly armies worked. They would keep working essentially until the age of mass society, Napoleonic era. I made multiple videos on the topic. They were pretty ferruginous, unwieldy forces, but they were actually starting to become more agile, more elastic. Here we see, however, also pretty big forces for the time standards that naturally leveled the odds as a consequence. Plus, you have such great commanders at work who knew what they were doing. And you understand, especially Turenne's sort of here counteroffensive capacity is really striking. Montecuccoli, as we've seen, is more defensive-minded, but it's also a matter of literally like, the contingency. I mean, the French had a better army, qualitatively speaking. The Imperials, we've seen it also at the Battle of Strasbourg, were not as sort of tendentially uniformed and sort of logistically served, as a matter of fact. It's two different countries. From one side you have France, from the other you have Germany. And so there you know all the limits, especially of the empire in this much more fragmented reality. So this is a very interesting scenario with incredible players. Other important fact here that I can't stress enough, already highlighted twice, is again the striking infantry-cavalry ratio. Right, infantry is decisive at this point in the history of the art of war. Pike and shot warfare is still basically there. I mean, it's ever more shot than else, and so this, since, as you know, well, actually, at the mid-16th century, people just mentioned the Swedes of Gustavus Adolphus, but it had been happening for quite a while. There's no doubt that the Swedish king, also because of his experience against that anachronism of success of the Polish hussars, had given quite a sort of blow right to the tactical, to the arms ratios in the 30 Years' War, and individuals like Turenne and Montecuccoli had definitely learned this. I mean, Montecuccoli had, as you know, been captured by the Swedes, and he had also been starting to write his theoretical work of the art of war in prison on that occasion during the 30 Years' War. So, nevertheless, so you would expect some coming back with the end of the pike of cavalry, but we know that cavalry would not take over. Nevertheless, we see essentially a 1-to-1 ratio, right? Slightly more infantry, admittedly, but if you consider like these tens of thousands of cavalrymen, and this is something that, okay, they're not the knights of the Middle Ages. It's a bit of a different situation. We've seen dragoons, but there are also cuirassiers, and at large, just the figure, the scale is astonishing in terms of shock power. Also maneuverability, because you understand here in these clashes there is a lot of quite rapid maneuvering, redeployment, battling over very specific choke points, bridges, crossings of different kinds. So cavalry there is really something that can stem also in a defensive and therefore counter-offensive fashion, a very, very tough ground against its enemy counterpart. We were talking about this in the video about the German peasant revolt at the beginning of the 16th century. We were noticing there that an army like the one of the Duke of Lorraine that intervened in Germany had incredibly high level of horsemen over infantry in a de facto Renaissance scenario, but a heavily feudalized one. Well, here we see even a higher ratio of cavalry, something apparently incredible. And it's not like, as we've seen, there weren't sieges. Naturally, when you look at the frontier, the Rhineland, Alsace, Lorraine, this was historically, as you know, fairly decentralized reality to begin with, all right? It was sort of fractal. France had been just re-emerging from important issues in her history, the wars of religion, also the internal front and so on, to recompact, especially under Louis XIV, this tendentially continental hegemonic power as we define it. And so these were the areas that were expanded, and there was a sort of power vacuum in them. Equally, Germany was pretty fragmented, as we've seen. The Habsburgs are sort of gradually rising in power, but it's all very difficult. It costs a lot. We've seen also what happened with the siege of Vienna is the great shocker, right? And here, Montecuccoli was the guy who literally saved the city there from this sort of slumber that especially Leopold I, characterally speaking, incarnates. Hadn't been for more sort of volatile figures like Father Daviano during the siege, etc., things would have really gone terribly. More than they actually went, aside from the fact that eventually the Christians won, and then from there, also thanks to Prince Eugene, things started taking off in a pretty expansive direction. But the Habsburgs really risked in that moment, and because of this very, very old, sort of very primitive mechanism of Central European sort of feudal society that hadn't had much of the surplus, the resources to concentrate power and so on. And we have an entire series about the Habsburgs, where we've seen all the Outlander, the Crown lands, and so on. France naturally here is bringing something completely different on the table, as we've seen also in the video about the French invasion of the Netherlands in 1672, which starts this what we've seen here. The following year to 1675, to the death of Turenne, and eventually the withdrawal of Montecuccoli, who also died 5 years later. So the shock power is very interesting here. Cold steel, I've seen very brutal losses, a pretty sound French infantry capacity as well, sound artillery, right, from the French side as well. Again, the Imperials were just not as updated and powerful as the French. But they are still, however, one of the few regional powers that can allow, together with allies, as we've seen, to field up to 50,000 men, which is something really extraordinary, incredibly costly. And so there's obviously a political and financial background to this campaigns in the Rhineland that is quite fascinating. It's not like France was not making a gigantic effort. It was also a very big country, but again, even in order to put it together, in order to field such force, and not just that numerically, say, or materially, but forging generals like Turenne was something definitely remarkable. But you really want to appreciate the modernaise Montecuccoli because of his insane expertise, and we've seen also in the series about Prince again that I have to restart, and I'm sort of delaying, but because we have so much to do really, that even men like Caparado, there's all a set of also not just Italian but also Czech, Hungarian generals next to the Germans amongst probably the head of the Habsburgic armies that are incredibly fascinating figures. We should, if anything, make an entire video about that, because historically this nobility, especially also still until the early 20th century, until the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were considered part of this multinational ensemble that the empire represented. So there is a level of tradition. Here we focus mostly on the strategical and the operational aspects. But the motivations, as we've seen in many videos, are definitely, and I wrote this also for the Nuova Antologia Militare, that, as you know, this year Al literally asked me, right, called me to write a column for them. And this is an Italian military history journal, and they probably didn't even know that I'm a medievalist, but they contacted me anyway because of this modern warfare content that I make, and that, as you know, embraces lots of different aspects of warfare, also anthropological, religious one. So I thought also to expand, because I ran a test a couple of months ago. As you know, you can see in the, I don't know how you call it this in English, where there are all the announcements on the channel, the same YouTube, a test of what you wanted to see more. And there are lots of people who want to see more modern warfare. And admittedly, even though we actually made a lot of that, historically on Schwerpunkt it was somehow all more either an anthropological, some sort of more thematic thing. So it's only from last year, from this year, that we started making proper, what I now call strategy. I will also be more specific with another playlist titled Campaign, content that doesn't just look at, I don't know, the general warfare or technological aspect, but in fact more battles, more campaigns, and we're really doing well, right? I think that Turenne and Montecuccoli's Rhine campaigns are such a classic. I really wanted to cover on Schwerpunkt from a very long time. And you understand that Turenne's campaigns from Sinsheim to Salzburg showcased his unparalleled mastery of maneuver, deception, and aggression, right? So the whole package, having the means to enact that. This is a very important aspect in the history of the art of war, that there were Hannibals even in prehistory. But since I didn't have the same level of armies development and sort of historiographical documentation and so on, they didn't, of course, they didn't have the practice at large itself, but they didn't have the opportunity either to sprout, right, and to emerge like this. So always evaluate the civilizational level of a country, because also evaluating the ability of a commander has a lot to do with that. It's not the case of Turenne, like saying, he was good because, he had France to back him, right? But he was good because he was good, and in that position, as we've seen, he was perfect. And so that's not just a cheat. You must be up to that, which is increasingly more difficult. However, it's also literally because he had the support. His rapid marches as at Ensheim and audacious winter operations, which normally was still, I've seen it also recently with Marlborough, were in the 18th century considered like, okay, stop at that point, right? So there was almost prefiguration of some more contemporary warfare, or at least something that would have been surpassed for different strategic and logistical reasons, mostly just later. Warfare was waged in winter, also throughout all eras. I mean, as a medievalist, I can't ever testify to that. It wasn't that common, and especially also with such big armies and trying to achieve such specific goals with the terrible weather, as we've seen, attrition, illness is something terrifying. At Turkheim, also Turenne demonstrated his ability to outmatch larger forces through speed, surprise, and logistical resilience. Montecuccoli, his equal in strategic foresight, there is no doubt, countered with meticulous restraint, right? Avoiding decisive battles until opportunity arose, as at Salzburg, where Turenne's death shifted the balance. This is really important because of what we just said about the Habsburgic forces' constraints to begin with. Montecuccoli likely would have, really shined. From the French side, you have this kind of, game, mind game, if you think about Prince Eugene, and what later Louis XIV said after having exiled him, that he really regretted enormously having done that, given also the baths of French blood that were caused by the Allied forces under him and Marlborough. And so there is all an obvious sort of prudence, a greater strategic and logistical restraint from the imperial side, because there is just so much they can do through the sort of the Habsburgic imperial basis. Turenne and Montecuccoli's rivalry was a delicate balance of advance and retreat, feint and counterfeint, epitomizing 17th century warfare, where logistics, terrain, and morale were as critical as firepower. What is fascinating of this campaign is, in many ways, the mobility, right? These different approaches, also in the times in which it was either just Turenne or just Montecuccoli alone, right? When Montecuccoli was aware Turenne had died, show you how dynamic this theater is, how sort of greatly skilled commanders could really take things very far in terms also strategic projection of boldness, etc. This is an aspect that is difficult really to really explain in a YouTube video without some more thorough and focalized study, also with a map at hand. We will do this stuff because we've already done this in certain videos, etc. But today was mostly just to illustrate the wall. Here, every campaign would deserve a single video to understand really the difficulties, the capacities, and so on, right? But there is a fluidity in warfare. That's what most people tend to see, to unsee about war. They tend to reduce it to a deterministic or to a tendentially predictable mechanism. That's not how warfare actually works. Actually, it's in interest of what can happen in terms of seriousness, dreadful consequences. Warfare is the field in sort of human sort of commitment where not just everything is actually all directly humanly controlled, because there are things that are out of your control, but not in the sense that you're not in control of your army, all right? So we were talking from a strictly military point of view, then there is politics as well. That's another story as well that complicates the thing. But it's also the one that, at the end of the day, is less predictable. You have an enemy that, we've seen von Clausewitz's rules of reciprocity. The enemy is there. It's not sitting ducks. It's not just there to be beaten. He will adapt and counter-strike at some point. So there is always this balance shifting back and forth, offensive, counter-offensive, initiative, the passivity, of offensive, defensive, and it's very much constantly moving. This is also what we get from the Clausewitzian theory that, by the way, was bringing also Turenne and Montecuccoli as examples of, from the Prussian generals' sort of awareness of this giants of warfare. Turenne's death was definitely a turning point, robbing France of its most formidable commander, because he was at the time, and leaving a void that Condé could not fully fill, and not just because of his ailments. Montecuccoli's strategic patience secured a temporary imperial advantage, but his withdrawal underscored the limits of his resources. Right? Their legacy etched in the campaigns of 1673-1675 remains a testament to the art of war, blending logistical precision, tactical innovation, and strategic genius in a theater where every move was a calculated gamble. That's also very much the essence of the military, gambling, the second element of the Clausewitzian wonderful trinity, influencing military thought for generations and cementing their place as titans of the era, because they fully embraced that gamble. They fully chased Fortuna and Victoria, that, as we've seen also theologically, and it's right, they were perfectly aware of that in the Renaissance, were properly and deeply entwined with, of course, also at that point, the Christian and providential view of the world, with the essence of what it meant to be a military man. All right. I'm also glad to make ever more French warfare, especially as far as medieval and modern, especially modern warfare is concerned, right? Really have infinite possibilities. This year we made the Battle of Bergen. We actually made different videos also, like Last year we were making most of these days the Mousquetaires de la Maison du Roi. Last year we also made that video about the generals of Henry IV and Louis XIII's libraries, what they read, these people. They didn't care about military treatises at all. They studied history more than else. We talked about, from Valère to Gribeauval's system, from French artillery. We talked about the British strategy of the 7 Years' War, that in any case involved the French from the other side. We talked about Canadian warfare, from the War of the League of Augsburg to the one of Austrian succession. Then recently we made that video about, in fact, the Rampillard, the French invasion of the Netherlands in 1672, and also more recently the Battle of Dreux, 1562, from the French Wars of Religion. We really must continue like this. I would really like to enter a bit more in the depths of the 30 Years' Wars. The Italian wars, I think, never really ever made a single battle. We have to talk more about Spanish warfare, the Tercio. We absolutely must do something like this. Also the German Wars of Religion. Moodbug, something, the War of the League of Schmalkald or something like that. There is such an enormous amount of stuff to cover, and you realize that on Schwerpunkt we can't really afford to leave anything unexplored and untouched. It feels as if we really hadn't done anything, as a matter of fact. Modern French warfare, this is just the 22nd video. It's too few, right? Let's see, modern English warfare, 21, almost the same. I didn't plan that, so to say. Spanish, let's see, modern Spanish, because I have all this tabernacle in front of me for recording. I have the keyboard from the other side. I have to stretch. So, yeah, well, we made something that's mostly related to the Armada. Well, not only, but it's too few. It's, how much is it? 11, not 10, too few. Really too few. We must make really a lot more about Spanish warfare. And so we are, again, patiently, it takes a while to to formulate a correct, an adequate video to distribute. I tend to I try to make everything very balanced, because I can't make too many similar videos in a row, something very similarly themed, etc. But also, the more we do in a strictly military historical sense, the better it is. Really, we have really a lot of stuff incoming, and it never ends. And so everything gets down to how far we go. Me making videos, you supporting, and that's the tandem that we really want to see as a team. Very well. However, again, I was very glad to talk about this topic today in particular. However, for today, I also stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.